Greetings, everyone. This is Forging Hardspace Shipbreaker. We're going to talk about our journey the last 4.5 years as we made this game and some lessons that we learned and some things that we can share with all of you. So who are these people that you're seeing in front of you? I'm Rory McGuire. I'm the Chief Creative Officer here at Blackbird. I've been in the games industry almost 20 years now. I've got to work on a ton of amazing brands and IP. Most recently, we've contributed to the Minecraft series. But I've also got to work on some original IP, which is what we've did here with Hardspace Shipbreaker and what we're going to be talking about.
And I'm Elliot Hudson. I'm Associate Creative Director here at Blackbird. I've been with Blackbird for about, I think, 8 years now. I started on a game called Hardware that eventually became Deserts of Karak. And for the past 4 years, I've been working on what eventually would become Hardspace Shipbreaker.
But it wasn't always Shipbreaker. So we're going to go through the journey and share some things with you guys. So who are we as a studio? We were founded in 2010. We're based out of Vancouver, BC. The studio was founded by a number of EA and Relic folks. And really the goal was to create incredible games, original games, games that people could be immersed into, games that when you're playing them, the screen edge disappears and you just fade into the game. Our first game was in 2016, Homeworld Deserts of Karak launched. We had been working on a game that was kind of a spiritual successor to Homeworld, and while we were developing that, the Homeworld IP actually went up for auction. We bid on it, but we were also dramatically outbid by Gearbox. But the first thing that happened was Gearbox reached out to us and said, hey, would you guys like to do something with us? And at that time, we were working on this incredible game. That launched in 2016. And we're about 79, 80 on Metacritic, but amongst PC gaming focused sites, namely PC Gamer, GameSpot, IGN, they gushed, they loved the game, and that kind of put us on the map. Shortly after that, we collaborated with NASA's JPL on what was called Project Eagle, which was imagining a Mars base 100 years from the day it launched. That was an interesting process because we often create ideas on our own, but in this case, we're creating concept and then vetting them with engineers and biology, xenobiologists and all these crazy things at JPL. That went onto Steam for free to celebrate NASA's InSight landing. And then finally, what we announced last year, Homeworld 3, which we announced in September on stage with Gearbox at PAX. We all miss PAX. But we're not talking about any of these today. We're talking about Shipbreaker. Shipbreaker went onto Steam's right around a month ago, a month and a couple of days. And it has, we spent a couple of days at the top of the Steam charts, but the press and the fan response to it has just overwhelmed us. And that's just what we're going to be talking about today.
So just a quick look at what Shipbreaker is. So Shipbreaker, obviously you play the Shipbreaker and you work in this salvage yard for this company that sends you these derelict ships. And your job is to strip these things down, try to salvage all the valuable materials, all the components, etc., and try to get as much value of the ships as possible. But just like real-world shipbreaking and real-world salvaging, it can be extremely dangerous. There's fuel running through these ships, electrical systems, they have faulty reactors in them, lots of ways for you to die. The company will just clone you and throw you back in the yard. So it's all about trying to escape that seemingly endless cycle.
So what we built was quite unusual and quite different. One of the things the team struggled with was there weren't a lot of market comparables or games that were in the market that were similar. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we got there, both from a brand side or IP side as well as gameplay side. And really that was driven through the goals that we set initially and the goals that we continued to calibrate with the team as we were working on it. And then what we're hoping is you're going to go on this journey with us through the last 4.5 years. We have slides that are about learnings and they're labeled learnings, but we also have a ton of slides that are actually from team presentations at those times. You'll be looking at videos that we presented at those times. So you'll get to see a little bit about how the game evolved and get some takeaways from it. So as a studio, we've modeled ourselves after, these kind of legendary studios, or certainly legendary studios. Other studios similar to this would be Psyonix that most recently did Rocket League. And what these studios did, aside from being known for being just incredible and producing incredible games, they began doing work for other people, which is what we did as well, is they took on games with other people's IP. In the case of Gearbox, who we know quite well, we've worked with them on a couple of games. Gearbox began by making incredible FPSs. For example, the expansion to Half-Life, like what an amazing gig. Or the PC port of Halo, again, what an amazing gig, to build out their tech base, to build out their studio, and then start taking shots at games of their own. So in the case of Gearbox, that was Brothers in Arms, but really it's stuck with Borderlands. In the case of Blizzard, we all know Rock and Roll Racing and the Lost Vikings, but really it's Warcraft that that set the stage, and then after that, World of Warcraft. So this is what we've modeled ourselves after, which is that we're building these incredible games, we're building this incredible technology. We're also able to take our own shots and build our own games.
So the journey for Shipbreaker starts at the beginning of 2016. We had just shipped Deserts of Karak, and the studio hadn't quite spun up our next big project yet. So there had a lot of people who needed something to do, something to work on, and it was also an opportunity for us to decompress a little bit from working on Deserts of Karak, and then also do some creative bloodletting and just kind of refresh ourselves. And so Blackbird decided to run an internal game jam. So we split into teams of about 7 to 8 people. I think there was about 5 teams total. And everyone was involved. Accounting, our IT manager was involved. Audio engineers were involved. It was great. It was really fun. And I happen to be part of a team that worked on something called Hello Collector, which is what we're going to look at because that was where Shipbreaker started.
Yeah, so out of 5 teams, we had just this remarkable game appear.
Yeah, so the goal for the jam, for this demo here that we're looking at, was recreate that sense of in the movie Gravity of Sandra Bullock spinning through debris, barely held on by a cable that's keeping her from flinging off into the void. So you have a very simple set of mechanics. You can grab and crawl along these debris pieces. You have your grapple that can pull you around, and that's essentially it. And your objective is to climb through this swirling debris field and find the valuable resources without getting flung off into the void. Extremely effective. It was super tense to play and very rewarding, very successful.
So we did a big review with the whole studio. At the time, it was probably 60 folks, and we looked at all of the Game Jam games, and the sense in the room was electric that we had to make Hello Collector into a game. Like, everyone produced these awesome games for the Game Jam, but I probably had 10 people come up to me afterwards that weren't on the team talking about, are we going to make this game? It's super cool. Let's make this game. Let's do this thing. So it literally took about 2 days before we had a full green light, and we set a goal. I think we started production about a month later, or we started the team going about a month later. And the team, what was the Hello Collector team, the Game Jam team, began working on what we would call Project Lynx, or codename Lynx. And right off the bat, we wanted to set goals for the team. We talked a little bit about this earlier. There's a phenomenon that was observed by sociologists in the criminal justice system where detectives are deeply incentivized to solve cases. They're called clearance rates. And from an outside perspective, or even if you're in the system, that makes sense. Detectives solve cases. But what happens is that detectives are now incented to progress their careers to not take on cases that are difficult to solve. And that's not actually what we want from our detectives. Now, this is something that was observed, and many changes have been made to that system. But it's a very human thing that when you set a goal in front of someone, they try to solve it. And sometimes that means not taking on cases where there's out there somewhere. It's a hard case to solve. So in the case of Shipbreaker, we didn't set a goal where we said, we want you to make a shitload of money, or we want you to make a ton of money. We want you to ship a game that has 10 million active users or anything like that. We set 3 really simple goals. Was that 1, we want you to ship. 2, we want you to make an original game that is unusual. And 3, we want it to be an original IP that is ours. And we didn't set any other goals aside from that. There were times where we did financial forecasts, but those didn't go into team-facing goals, and they were extremely conservative because we didn't want pressure on the team to do something else.
So then like Rory said, we started development on trying to turn this into a full-fledged project. And this is a screenshot from around that time. And really what we were doing is we were just taking all the stuff we liked about the Game Jam and really trying to inflate it and stretch it into a full-sized game. So rather than like a randomized debris field, here you are at a space station that's falling apart, and your objective is to try to clamber your way inside that station and find out why it's crumbling to pieces. And you would start to move through other locations throughout this galaxy. And it was fun. It was really exciting. We started adding more maneuvering mechanics, more gameplay, more hazards. But then we started to work on the actual tone and narrative direction of the game as well. And so this is where we were. This is a slide from that time where we did an exercise of trying to place ourselves on a sort of tone spectrum. The Game Jam had a lot of tense gameplay. It was very dark. But you'd also get these very satirical and sardonic emails from the company that had sent you out to the depths of space. So there was this kind of humor to it, a very dark humor. And so between something that's very light and satirical and something that's straight up dark horror, we sort of felt that we were kind of in the middle of that. We're showing that here because this is one of the big things that we would start to reevaluate as we continue to progress through development.
As Elliot said, we had a ton of mechanics that we thought were really impressive. Like at this point, we were 8 months into, 6 months into development, something like that. And we had all the mechanics that we list here. This is from the presentation that was made to the team when we evaluated it. All of these features are in the game 4 years later, or all of these mechanics are in the game 4 years later. We really loved the viscerality of grabbing onto a ladder, grabbing onto a piece of wreckage and spinning with it with 0G. We thought it was really cool.
Yeah.
But once we got this build and we got the mechanics together and we were able to look at it and we were able to step back from it, there were some lessons, which is one of our next learnings, which is when we first began development on what would become Shipbreaker, which was at the time called Codename Lynx or Project Lynx. We felt that milestones and gates were things that publishers forced on developers, or not forced on developers, but it was part of that process. It was part of that social contract or business contract that you get with publishers. We were making our own original IP. Everything was in-house. We were like, we don't need to do gates or milestones. And we spent about 5-6 months in that view or that worldview when we realized, like, actually gates and milestones, even if we're not triggering a payment or all the business things associated with it, it lets us take a moment to evaluate the game, to build it up to a point where we can all look at it, we can all talk about it, and then have an official takeaway of this is the feedback, this is what we're going to do next, and we can plan for the future. So, our first, or one of our early lessons is kind of a goofy one, but we aren't above gates and milestones. We're not beyond the law. Like, it's important to take these inflection moments and look at the game. The second is, we're going to talk more about what happened out of this first milestone, but there was something really important that we wanted to embrace and really lean into. So what we're looking at here is the evolution of what would become Halo. So on the far left is the original Halo prototype, or at least in the public, this is the original Halo prototype, which is a sci-fi RTS for Mac using soldiers from the future that are battling in vehicles that are roughly to scale. There's something obviously really cool there, and actually if you look at the very top of the screen, that is a tank that is incredibly similar to what would actually ship in Halo. But they didn't keep that game. Clearly they played it, they iterated on it, and they decided that there was something cool here, but they wanted to remove something from it and refocus it. So in the middle, you can see this is where it became a third-person action game. I'm not sure what the platform is at this point. I'm fairly certain they're still on Mac. And then the thing on the far right is an HD version of what would actually ship of Halo Combat Evolved, which was a first-person, Xbox-only title. A radical transformation in terms of what the game was, but at the same time you can see the threads of DNA or them following the breadcrumbs as they're doing each iteration of Halo to find that. And that was something really important to us, and it's something we wanted to preserve and hang on to. If you're curious about the evolution of Halo or the development of Halo, there's a ton of articles on this online, and I don't want to turn this into a GDC talk on a postmortem on Halo, but it was important to us to follow the breadcrumbs.
Yeah, exactly. And like Rory said, we didn't do the gates at first. For the first half a year of development, really, it was just let the team do their thing. They're creative. They'll come up with something cool. But what we realize is that the gates are really important to evaluate whether you are following those breadcrumbs that are working. This is a slide from one of the gates, I think probably the last gate before we decided to make a pretty big change to the game. And we had come up with something that we thought was really strong. Like objectively, it was a good game, but it had this sort of cosmic horror, dark, slow, plodding pace to it. And it just wasn't something that Blackbird as a studio felt would fit in their roster of games. It wasn't the type of game that they wanted to make. And so that's where we had to really step back and find what do we like about what's here and what do we want to add to this to take it in a different direction.
Yeah, so we took just a few days with the team evaluating the build, talking about it, and we decided that we were going to move away from what we built.
Yeah, so at the very beginning, that was the end of 2016, the very beginning of 2017, we started to work on something called Falling Skies. And this was our first pivot of Hella Collector, which would then become Shipbreaker eventually. And Falling Skies was basically there's this battle happening above Earth. There's these ships that are taking damage and getting destroyed, and they're slowly falling through the atmosphere, threatening to smash into the ground and cause massive devastation. And so you take your grapple gun, which we had already, and you basically Spider-Man from falling ship to falling ship. And this is where we introduced a new mechanic, a new breadcrumb, which would be the cutting tool. So you would slice these ships up until they were small enough that they just dissipate in the atmosphere and they don't cause a hazard anymore. There was some issues with this pitch, even though it was very fun, it was very action-oriented. We called it Fruit Ninja in Space. We found that there was actually a problem.
Yeah, we were really excited about this concept of cutting, but overall, we weren't happy where we ended up tonally.
Yeah, we took that back to the team. We chatted with them about it. We worked on it, I think, for maybe 2 months tops. And what became clear is that the team wasn't happy with this concept, with this tonal shift. In trying to address the concerns with Hello Collector being too slow and too plodding, they felt that we had gone and done an over pivot, that we'd gone towards something that was far too action arcadey, that didn't leverage the mechanics very well, that we had lost actually a breadcrumb along the way, that sense of relatability and this personal touch that the game had. And it didn't feel unique anymore. It felt like you were just kind of a super soldier like you see in so many other games. Whereas in Hello Collector, you felt like a real person out in space.
So the team came to the creative leadership at Blackbird and essentially said, we don't really want to do this. And so we said, okay, well, what excites you guys? Or you folks, excuse me. And they come up with 4 ideas, and which they pitched.
Yeah, exactly. So we realized rather than try to come up with something else, take it back to the team, see if they like it, go back, we could just flip-flop there forever. Like Rory said, we decided to do this more collaboratively. So we came up with a bunch of different concepts that we could possibly do. All of these leveraging the mechanics that we knew we really liked, the zero-G stuff and the cutting. So there's Falling Skies. Saboteur was all about using your cutter to penetrate through this invasive alien colony ship and try to destroy the fleet. Knight Errant was traveling through deep space with your grapple and your cutting tool and battling these giant ship-like Leviathan creatures. Kind of wacko, but kind of cool. And then the last concept that we hit on was this idea of someone just working in a salvage yard, being given these derelict ships and having to tear them apart and salvage them.
And as Elliot said, all of these used grappling. They were all first person. They all involved cutting heavily, like whether we were cutting into a mothership or cutting into some space beast. But there was one idea, again, that stood head and shoulders above the rest, which was this concept of tearing apart derelict starships in search of value and all the threats that each one of these ships have.
Exactly, yeah.
So it began a change. We didn't like the fantasy and tone that we first had with Hello Collector, and we began discussing what our new fantasy is.
Exactly. So up until this point, we've been following these little breadcrumb trails to see where this game would take us, where it wanted to take us. And this was the tonal shift that it would end up actually being basically an entire loaf. This is something that we got so excited about as a team, as a studio, as an executive team. It was just something that had so much potential, talking about the working class hero, that sense of nobility in the work you do, the reward of hard work, contributing something bigger than yourself, and contrasting that with industry and systems that exploit those kinds of people. It was also an opportunity to bring back a lot of the humor and personality that Hello Collector had. And what's amazing, so this is, again, is a slide from 2017, right when we made that pivot. What's amazing is you can see this in the game today.
Yeah, interestingly, right before the game went live, there was a preview where they gushed about how the game felt like Brazil in space.
Yeah.
And we were like, yes,
nailed
did
it.
it.
So this was really a thing that we could sink our teeth into that we were really excited about.
Totally. And this informed a new set of pillars, a set of changes to what we were trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we took that tone and through a collaborative exercise with the team, came up with our pillars. And these aren't design pillars. They're not art pillars and audio pillars. These are game pillars. And at Blackbird, we use these to inform all of the disciplines. So it's really important that these are strong and that they're very precise in what they're trying to convey. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that. But this is where we were, 2017. This, I think, maybe from the same presentation as the last slide. Blue collar fantasy, that's been our guiding star through this whole thing, and you'll see that rarely ever changes. The other ones get nuanced a little bit, but
you'll also see their DNA. They don't completely go away at this point. So let's talk a little bit about pillars. So this is something, I first heard that associated with Relic. I mean, we have many Relic folks here at Blackbird, so we kind of inherited this process. This is pretty much industry standard now at this point. There's 2 really great talks, one from at GDC. Josh Mosquera gave a talk, and Jay Wilson gave a talk, both of which are about Diablo 3 and the pillars that they had, including when they pivoted into Rebirth Souls. These are some of our guidelines for pillars. One is we, in general, make authentic team product-facing pillars, authentic game-facing pillars. Make pillars that the team can understand and connect with. If you have strategic business pillars, that's fine. That's fine to have at an executive level or at a marketing level, but it's not something that teams get excited about, right? We also, in general, we try to be really specific. All of our our pillars after a certain point. I actually noticed earlier that in our earliest pillars, we were not obeying this, but we tried to get really descriptive in the pillars and evocative with the pillars so that the team can repeat them often to each other, that they can talk about blue collar fantasy. I think if we were to measure the amount of times people on the Lynx team said blue collar fantasy, it'd be like in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, huge.
But we do refine them over time, which we'll see even with these pillars here, we're going to see them changing as we move through.
And like I mentioned, we do this as a collaborative process with the team. It's not like the creative director or the game director goes off and decides what the pillars are and dictates that back down. We find that the most effective way to do it is to come to those pillars with the team for a couple of reasons. One is your pillars will probably be stronger because you'll talk through all of the issues with it and you'll massage it into a place that it actually has a lot of meaning. And the other is that people will feel super invested in those pillars and they'll take that out into their work. And you won't even have to do much maintenance on it. You won't have to repeat it very often. People will actually, they'll surface in the stuff that they're doing every single day. So that's why it's extremely important to us that we do this as a team process.
Yeah, and just as examples of that, like, you can direct your audio director to give you the sounds of industry and blue collar fantasy, or they can take that pillar away and in the background you can hear the sounds of metal colliding and it evokes that and you never even ask for that. So ideally that's the position that you're in with the entirety of your team.
And then this is just an example of a whiteboard from one of those exercises with the team trying to arrive at those pillars. And we actually heavily use something called the MDA framework. MDA stands for Mechanic, Dynamic, Aesthetic. And typically it's used as an analysis tool for complete games to try to determine, okay, how do the mechanics of this game interact with one another to create these dynamics, which are then perceived and interpreted by the player as the aesthetics of the game, the livable experience of the game, the emotional experience of the game. And we actually use it because we had a list of mechanics that we knew we really liked. We showed that earlier in the presentation. We had this new aesthetic that we knew we wanted to hit, the blue collar vibe, the industrial sci-fi vibe. And so this was really an exercise with the team to figure out how do we massage those existing mechanics? How do we add just a few more layers of systems in there to create the dynamics that we believe are going to create the aesthetic we want? And then enshrining all of that logic into pillars.
And this exercise took actually a week or more. We went through and looked at these mechanics and the things that we wanted to achieve. But we would start to really dial in what we thought the game was. So at this point, the team begins working on a vertical slice, which we're seeing here. It's worth pointing out this footage is none of this shipped in the game, but it is very close to what we shipped. We're seeing the cutting applied. We're seeing grabbing objects and moving them. We're seeing this here, the reactor, interacting with the environment in compelling ways. And everyone that saw this is like, yes, like all systems go, let's put this into production. We're good.
Yeah, totally. This is just under 2 years ago, probably. And this is clearly the game that we wanted, 100%. Like it has everything in it that you see nowadays, the salvage bay that you salvage in, the freeform cutting in the ships, salvaging these hazardous things. But it was all handcrafted. And so that's where we found we actually had a problem, not thematically, not creatively. There was actually a production problem. That leads us towards our last pivot of the game.
Yeah, so we were ready to put this game into development. But once we realized, or into production, excuse me, we were already in development. Once we realized there was a problem, is that the team to make this vertical slice essentially hand-built that ship. And we would need to hand-build all of the remaining ships, which the team felt could only be 3 or 4 with a medium-sized team. That was a problem because that meant that we would need to focus the game on a 5 to 10 hour experience, which is of course doable. And there were games coming out at that point, like Firewatch, we were talking about quite a bit, that can do this, but it actually felt disconnected from the game we've been talking about. If you look at all of the pillars that we've been sharing over time, nowhere in there is there a narrative. Nowhere in there is the player is this person and their journey is this. Like we had conversations about it, but in order to build a 5 to 10 hour experience, a core part of that is the narrative. And that felt a little bit disconnected to take that from being a 0% or a small percent emphasis to like a 30 or 40% emphasis. So we actually didn't want to go down this path. It was also informed by business conditions as well, as we did want to target early access. And we knew that a traditional story game, it typically doesn't do well in early access. And we did want to engage with that. And we wanted to grow this game with the community. So we set out to do the first impossible task that we built was cutting. The second impossible task that we put in front of the team was essentially taking all these beautiful starships that we've been making at Blackbird and make them into kind of pseudo-procedural generated randomized ships.
Yeah, this was really the final breadcrumb for the thing that would become Shipbreaker, and that was fully embracing systemic designs, like Rory saying, pseudo procedural modular ships, taking all that gameplay that we liked about that vertical slice, chunking it up and trying to figure out how to make it dynamically mix and match to provide way more breadth of content and experience for the player than we could ever hope to do building by hand. And so that went beyond just the ships. We actually doubled down on making the actual elemental systems of the game far more interactive and systemic, heavily inspired by Breath of the Wild's element system, which I think had just come out right around this time. And things like equipment decay and having to maintain your tools and all of your vitalities and things like that, that all came out of this final pivot.
And the thing that's worth pointing out here as well is that this is, we are the studio, many of our artists and art directors worked on the original Homeworld and worked on Deserts of Karak and are now working on Homeworld 3. So the standard for ships in the studio of starships was extremely high. Yeah, and to build these procedurally with an art direction that everyone was happy with when they saw them was quite an achievement.
So now that we've got all the final pieces in place, I wanted to show the contrast between where the pillars were when we started to decide that we're going to make Shipbreaker and where they were when we shipped basically in January of this year. So in 2017, you can see the blue collar fantasy, tactical ship disassembly, and vehicle fantasy from the human perspective. And then what we shipped with was blue collar fantasy. That didn't change. Like I said, that has been one of the guiding forces of the whole game. Total ship disassembly was just a slight nuance to better inform people what we meant by that pillar. As Rory said, as you use these pillars, you're going to hone and refine them. And then the last, to be honest, that one was actually a bad pillar from the start. So vehicle fantasy is a reference to a pillar on our previous game, Deserts of Karak. So we were, subverting that pillar for use, and that made sense to people who had worked on Deserts of Karak. But as we hired more people for the team who hadn't worked on Deserts of Karak, it didn't make any sense. It was total, I think Rory calls it inside baseball.
Yeah, people just didn't understand. They were like, what is vehicle fantasy? Explain that to me. And it's like, well, there's this game.
Yeah, so there's a lot of hidden knowledge that's sort of required to understand that one. So we just got rid of that completely. And we realized we really need to make systems as content a pillar, that we're not going to try to handcraft stuff. We're going to try to have the game create these experiences.
So let's talk a little bit about some of our learnings through this experience. We learned a lot, and some of these we learned accidentally. Some of them were intentional, but we'll just share some of the things that we think were really important. So one is keeping the team size small. So we never really invested deeply into the team beyond, say, like 10 to 15 until we'd really dialed in the game, and we were really confident that we could pull it off, and the team was able to build prototypes and or production prototypes that we could actually get hands-on with and understand. But also on the opposite side is we didn't move people off of the team. For the most part, we kept people on the team. There was an odd 1 or 2 week pinch hitting for something. We pulled a couple of concept artists to help with something here and there, or a producer for a time period. But in general, we made a policy of not crippling the team by pulling people off, and a policy that we would not ever pause the team. This is also something that was shared by the folks at Psionics when they were building Rocket League, is that that game went through so many different pivots and changes, but they never paused it, even when they weren't quite sure what it was. And that's really important because the act of spinning it back up is way harder. It's way harder. The second is time boxing things. So in the case of Shipbreaker, we had 2 impossible asks that we talked about. It was cutting, and it was this concept of pseudo-procedural ships. Both of those, we essentially gave the team a period to evaluate it and actually discover whether or not this was doable. The first week, it was like, you guys are crazy. How can we possibly do this? But as they started to explore the concept, they started to make concessions here and there and like, hey, we can do the cutting this particular way if we change this particular thing, and we never, ever do this one thing. And we were actually able to pull it off. Same thing with the procedural ships. And the idea is, as long as we're making progress and we're moving towards these goals, we're generally fine. It's really easy as a studio and from the business perspective to get panicked about change. Change is good, and if you go back through the history of amazing IPs and original games, we gave the example of Halo, but StarCraft began, this is very public knowledge, that it began as Chris Metzen's crazy space vampire game. And it's like, what that connected with it with StarCraft, I have no idea. I'm sure there's a great story there. But that act of changing the game and pivoting and refining and changing is super healthy. The last thing or one of the last things is ask for help. We asked for a ton of help amongst amazing folks like Brian and Haley Martello from Gearbox, very heavily involved in the creative direction of Borderlands. They gave us so much guidance on this process and really helped us through building an original game. And then 4 amazing Vancouver-based independent developers, Shane Neville, Jamie Chang of Clay, Tyler Sigmund of Red Hook, and Derek Johnson of Thorium. Each one of these people contributed so much to this game and gave us so much guidance.
Yeah, we're extremely grateful to them.
And then our last insight is that, when you're making an original game, you don't always need a partner. If you have the funds, you don't necessarily need a partner. Or if you have the business acumen to publish a game yourself, you don't necessarily need it. But if you do want a partner, find someone that really likes your game for what it is. When we were shipping Deserts of Karak, we were showing it to publishers and to other potential partners. And it's a game about vehicles set on a desert planet, and someone asked us completely seriously, can you change out the vehicles for dragons? And we were like, we could. And maybe that was a good game somewhere. It's just not really our game. So in the case of Shipbreaker, the partner we found, Focus, loved the game for what it was. They were so excited about what it was, and they wanted to help us make it what it was, not change it into a game where you dismantle dragons.
Although Scalebreaker sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, Hardspace Scalebreaker. So this is where we ended up. So this is the launch trailer that we saw for Shipbreaker that was actually produced by Focus that came out right around launch day for early access.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been a phenomenal experience being early access. Like we knew that we loved this game internally as a studio. We always knew also that it was kind of a weird concept. We weren't sure how it would land when it finally got out there, but especially once Focus came on board and they got it immediately, we were like, okay, maybe there's some legs to this thing. And here we are in early access, and we've got just a phenomenal community. It's done super well, and they love it, and we're so happy to be talking to them about what to add to this, how to expand on this experience. They're giving us amazing fan art, amazing fan fiction. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey. Yeah, and to think this began with a tiny game jam, and though it's worth pointing out, you guys have seen the footage along the way, there's some things that still carried through. There's some things that we still shipped with that are pretty remarkable that we kept them through all of it.
And there's definitely code from the game jam still in the game.
You know that very well. Yes. So that's Shipbreaker. We're in early access on Steam. I am Rory McGuire, the Chief Creative Officer here at Blackbird.
And I'm Elliot, Hudson, Associate Creative Director.
If you guys have any questions at all about this process, what we went through, you have a question about some lore stuff that you experienced in Shipbreaker, or you have feedback about a game mechanic, we would love to hear it. So you can tweet at us here or just send us emails. Though we apologize if our spam filters go sideways.
Yeah.
So thank you all very much. Have a great GDC summer, and we will talk to you soon.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody.